Well, I would like first to welcome everyone to this third presentation today. I am very pleased to introduce Julie Stephen. Julie is head of the Market Development Latin American Partners and Special Project for SHL Americas. She's been in the industries for almost 2 decades in a variety of roles, including uh, consulting, account management, commercial leadership. As a product manager, she helped to launch SHL's Leader Edge and Mobilize products. She has a wealth of experience when it comes to diagnosing and developing talents to execute critical business objectives and has worked with organizations across the globe. Her specialties include Fortune 500 companies, healthcare, mergers and acquisition, talent acquisition, and leader solutions. Julie, welcome. Thank you for being here with us today.
Awesome. Thank you so much, and really excited to be spending some time with everyone today. As Benjamin mentioned, I am really excited to share some of the expertise I have in this area and hopefully change your mind around some of the really critical aspects to really think about really a beautiful succession process. So in the 20 years of experience I have, I've been able to work with organizations just about every size across the globe. And truly, the goal we have of today is to help prepare you and your organization to thrive in the future by having the right talent in the right roles to help your company soar. We're really excited and really grateful for EPSI, to all of our EPSI colleagues for the opportunity to co-present today. So certainly just want to let you know that EPSI is a strategic partner of SHL's, and we're excited for this opportunity. So during our time together, we are going to want to help broaden your thinking around how to effectively manage future talent and have the right leader bench in the future. We're going to walk through 4 pieces of truly best-in-class succession and growth strategy. So a strategic leadership alignment, high potential understanding, succession planning, and then readiness assessments or measurement. Please feel free, as mentioned, to use the chat function throughout the time, and I will, at the end of it, make sure we've got time for Q&A, or I'm happy to follow up with a written Q&A for those of you that were in attendance as well. So let me just quickly start explaining a little bit more about my organization and why I have a right to host this conversation today. I work for a company called SHL, and SHL is a global organization, and ultimately our core value is to help clients hire, promote, and develop the workforce you need in order to achieve your goal. We do this by aligning your business strategy with your people strategy and putting in place valuable people analytics programs, leveraging our deep roots in science and our best-in-class technology. And then, of course, maximizing the potential of our people. So to break it down just a little bit further, ultimately what we do is marry our deep roots in science. We are the largest employer of industrial psychologists with our technology and our people to really create the resilient, agile, and diverse workforce you need to succeed. So I mentioned a few of these, but just kind of a little bit more about who we are. We are the largest employer of industrial psychologists for any private organization across the globe. We help organizations make over 30 million assessment decisions or hiring decisions per year. Certainly, as I mentioned, we're a global organization operating in 100 countries and 39 languages. And ultimately, we have 45 billion data points, which help your organization ensure success. So let's dive in a little bit more to the actual process. And so for a strong succession strategy, 4 questions must be asked. The first is, what is our current bench strength and who are my high performers? That's what we call our strategic talent alignment. So beginning to understand how strong are we? What do we need to do to develop and shore up gaps today? And then who are the folks that we would really recommend potentially moving into a more senior role? The second question is, who has the potential to be successful at more senior levels? We call that high potential. So this is not measuring, do they have the potential to be the chief marketing officer or a director in our marketing team? It really is, do they have that raw DNA and the raw capability to be successful in more senior level roles? The third question is, what do they have potential for? This is a newer question when we begin to think about succession strategy. And when you think about this, previously, we would go directly from, do they have potential to, are they ready for this role? So this level of understanding high potential for what is something that's new to many organizations. And then, of course, the last question is, are they ready to step in the role once it's open? And we call that readiness. In my 20 years of experience and hundreds of organizations I've partnered with, very few organizations have been asking all 4 questions and using objective data to drive decision making. So if you haven't been asking all 4 at this point, you are not alone. But it also means your process could use some help. So just to understand a little bit more about where you are, I'm going to ask for a little audience participation next. And we're going to open up our first poll. And the poll is, where do you feel your organization is strongest across those 4 questions? Understanding bench strength, or understanding who your high performers are, understanding your high potentials, understanding high potential for what, or measuring readiness. So I'd like to ask for everyone to indicate what they feel their organization is strongest in this area. We're going to give you about another 10 seconds, and I'm going to count down 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, Benjamin, if we could, let's go ahead and close this poll. And great, exactly as we would expect. Most people have been spending most of their time looking at that, understanding who has high potentials. And certainly when we think about making selection decisions, oftentimes organizations look at readiness as a question. You can see that often organizations aren't focusing time on really understanding that core bench strength and having a great audit of current talent and looking at that high potential for what. So we're going to have one more question around audience participation. And the next question is, now that we understand what you're strongest in, where do you feel your organization is actually the weakest, with the same 4 questions? So Benjamin, if you would please open up this poll number 2. Again, where do you feel your organization is the weakest? Understanding bench strength or strategic talent alignment, identifying high potentials, looking at that raw DNA, understanding high potential for what, and/or are they ready to step in role? We're going to close it in 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Perfect. Great. No surprise there. Organizations really haven't been spending very much time understanding the talent they have today, which is really interesting when you think about the balance sheets we keep on our brick and mortar operations, or how much stock do we have of a product in place. We don't really do that for talent, and yet it's the #1 cost. And when you look at any budget line item, so unsurprising by this data, and certainly what we see typically, but I do think it's a great opportunity for us to grow. So let's move forward and let's talk a little bit about that strategic talent alignment. How do we make sure we have the right people in the organization to succeed, and who are our high performers? Because that's often the first question. And the reality is organizations are shifting and the world is changing at a faster pace than ever before. So much so that 90% of people have had to learn new skills in their current role, and completely new roles are being created. Existing roles are disappearing, and nearly half of organizations are restructuring. So our first piece of advice is to understand and think about the models you use for current performance. And is it time to do a redo? And so when we think about that, that's typically an organization's competency model. The average rule of thumb is every 3 to 5 years, it's time to take a quick peek at that. Obviously, due to COVID, so many things have changed, especially in how we do work. So it may be a ripe opportunity now to begin to look at those competency models to make sure the criteria you're using to measure performance is actually accurate and valid based on today's job requirements. Once you've done that, that's where we begin to look at understanding the strengths and weaknesses of your actual team. So the first question is, do we have the right criteria? Are the KPIs correct? Has the way of working changed? Do we need to update our job analysis? The second is understanding, do we have the right leaders in seat to be successful? And who are our high performers? And oftentimes in this stage, our organizations add on a third data point, which is how do we compare to others in our geography or industry? So understanding benchmark perspective. I want to make sure you understand this is not a manager review or performance management. This is really important because most people feel like general performance management is enough. But the reality is that is almost always purely subjective unless you've developed really clear behavioral anchored rating scales and have multiple objective data points that are factored in as well. Especially right now, when ensuring you have a diverse workforce is no longer a nice to have, it is critical to use objective measures to ensure you can cast the net wide. So if you think, gosh, we do this via performance management, make sure your performance management has clear behavioral anchored ratings and or other objective data that feeds into this. But this is the very first step to a really strong succession strategy. Let's move forward and talk a little bit about understanding who has the potential to be more successful in a more senior level. So now, as you saw in our last poll, many organizations spend a lot of investment around their high potential strategies, but very few hypo strategies are actually effective. And in fact, less than a third of organizations rate themselves as strong in identifying, developing, or engaging high potentials. Most organizations fall into the trap of taking their most successful performer and promoting them, despite decades of evidence that that's actually the wrong way to do it. Some organizations allow gut feel to guide their process, and I often ask those organizations, how many of you are divorced? So clearly gut feel is not always the best approach when you're looking at the divorce rate across our globe. And the third trend we find is a lot of organizations are betting on agility as the answer. For our purposes, we define agility as employees who are able to quickly and easily adapt to changing needs and new circumstances. And that's one area we want to shine the light on. So really quickly, we'd like to ask for a little bit more audience participation and like to open up our third poll. Has your organization considered using agility as criteria for potential? We'll give you about 10 seconds to fill this out. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Absolutely, exactly what we would expect. So as you can see, almost 80% of the organizations on the phone today have considered using agility as part of their criteria for potential. Now, let me explain to you why that's a shaky proposition. So when we begin to look at organizations, and again, many organizations out there utilize agility, what we understood is that actually the most high-performing leaders are not agile. So we'll talk about this research study a couple places today, but SHL conducted the most comprehensive private sector leadership study in the 21st century. And when we isolated leaders in the very top quartile of performance, over half, so 57% of those in the top quartile of performance are not agile. This proves to us that agility alone is not the answer. This doesn't mean agility isn't desirable or awesome. It just means that agility isn't something you can bank on, and because agility is born in versus being developed. So I want to take just a minute to understand that. Agility is something, when you think about initiative or adaptability or cognitive ability, that most people are born with a certain amount of agility naturally. And when we over-index on agility as the means to identifying high potential, what that means is we're developing a lot of jacks of all trade, masters of none. When we actually did this research and we began to understand and crack open leadership, what we saw is actually what we call a spiky profile. So many leaders are high in some areas and naturally lower in other areas. And that is A-okay. So when we think about this, think about a CFO. Things like analyzing and interpreting would need to be very high, but creating and conceptualizing wouldn't be necessarily as important for a CFO role. But for a chief marketing officer role, both would be very important. So the idea is not to focus on having these jacks of all trade. The idea is to understand the talent you have and the talent you need and match. And so have an agile process focused on constantly matching the role to the individual to be most successful. And in fact, when we begin to look at this, you'll see that organizations that focus on agility as their strategy are 71% less likely to be able to fill skill gaps with internal candidates, which means they have to go external. And there's a lot, we'll talk a little bit later about all the challenges with that. So to summarize, there are a number of issues beyond agility that we often see in high potential identification. Those include things about like having data only in one spot and/or understanding manager bias and how that plays into identifying high potential. Other organizations certainly have issues with data being siloed. So we've all worked with a talent porter or known one in the past. We don't have strong aggregate views across functions and across lines of business to help us look holistically at succession to understand perhaps if someone in a different function might be a better fit for this next role. And we're often limiting our pool unnecessarily based on who someone knows versus the actual talent that exists within an organization. And that's a heavy tax on your leaders. So what is the right answer? Ultimately, it is having insights gathered by by using objective and validated assessment solutions. That's really important to think about because almost all organizations do over-index on manager feedback or manager recommendations. And the reality is, we are fraught with our own perceptions and biases. I went to college with this person. I know this person well. I've worked with them for 20 years. They look and feel and act like I do. All of those are natural biases that play into our ability to identify true successors. Now utilizing a multitude of different assessment types from personality, cognitive ability, motivation, simulations, experience surveys, you really can begin to understand who has that raw potential and also make sure you've cast the net wide to help support our diversity and inclusion initiatives. We believe there are 3 critical questions to answer when you're thinking about high potentials. The first is, do you have aspiration? Meaning, do you have the motivation and drive to succeed at more senior levels? If you're high in this, you have an 11x higher probability to achieve an executive position. So do I have the drive? The second question is, do I have the ability? Meaning, can you do the job when you think about competencies, cognitive horsepower, etc.? Being high in this means you have a 12x likelihood of being effective in more senior roles. And then the last part of it is, do you have high engagement? Almost no organizations bring this into their high potential model, but it is really critical to understand because it means you'll stay and grow at your current organization versus developing people for success at other organizations. If you over-index in any one of these 3 things, your process will fall flat. It's really critical to have all 3, ability, aspiration, and engagement as part of our model. We do this by using 3 tools, just to give you insight into what our approach is. Ultimately, those tools are our occupational personality questionnaire, which is obviously a personality measure designed specifically for use in the workplace. It is trait-based versus type-based. So if you have seen any documentaries or read worrisome literature on the use of personality tools, ours has been designed specifically to be effective and validated for use in the workplace for selection decisions. The second tool we use is what we call our motivation questionnaire. That measures that desire to drive, what gets you excited to wake up in the morning and what really is going to entice great performance. And then, of course, we have a suite of interactive, mobile optimized, verify, or cognitive ability measures that we use to measure that cognitive horsepower as well. Now, many organizations are weary of using cognitive ability measures as part of their selection process in understanding high potentials. Ultimately, I get that, and we understand that, and we have opportunities to work around that. Some of the plus sides of using cognitive ability are, frankly, your leaders cognitive ability is required and it's not developable. So if you begin to develop someone that doesn't have that horsepower, it is a wasted investment for your organization. Alternatively, cognitive ability isn't developable and it can increase adverse impact. So if diversity is really critical, you may be willing to sacrifice that in the hopes of having a much broader and diverse candidate pool. Certainly that is something that you have the opportunity to monitor. There are several positive benefits to putting more rigor and structure on high potential identification. So let me just share a few of those with you. The first is organizations typically see focusing on this leads to higher engagement for their employees, certainly engaged to things like faster productivity, quicker to hire. So meaning you have an open position, a shorter amount of time. And then of course we can do it at half the cost because we have already groomed these people. We know they're going to be successful. We don't have issues with will they be successful in their job. And in fact, we know from our research, 46% of new leaders are actually unsuccessful at meeting their objectives in the first 6 months of their new role. And as we know, poor leadership ability decisions lead to poor business performance. So 43% of CEOs say that poor talent management has led them to not meeting their targets. And last but not least, we know that that doesn't impact, that impacts not only our business performance, but it also impacts retention, as 40% of departing employees say a lack of development was a key factor in their job satisfaction. So really important to think about understanding high potential in a way that's objective. It allows the field, the net to be cast wide and ensures a really diverse reap are all really important to ensuring strong business objectives or business outcomes. All right, we're going to move over to think a little bit about high potential for what, because this is different from what most people understand in today's world. So let's think about that. And when I mentioned before we'd done this research, I just want to point that out. It was a 3-year, very comprehensive study of leaders with almost 9,000 global leaders from 80 different organizations. And these leaders are from supervisor all the way through CEO. For each of these leaders, we gave them a battery of assessments. We understood their resume or their career experiences. We gathered data on their performance on the job against critical KPIs, how those KPIs were aligned to the business, how their direct reports would perceive them and would say their behavior was, and also how their leader was. When you think about all of those data points, it makes sense why this was the most comprehensive study of leadership to be done by any private organization, or really since the mid-1950s. The coolest part about this research is we were able to understand why some leaders are successful, begin to understand what contexts are really critical for success, and then in one role versus another, and then how to begin to predict that. So let's just dive into that a little bit more. This is not saying that competencies are not important. Context is another piece of the puzzle, so it's not a silver bullet. Competencies are the best way to identify who has that raw DNA or who is a high potential. It's brilliant at identifying individuals who have the skills and personality needed to be effective in a wide range of leadership roles. But competencies are too broad to help you target specific development and/or selection. And that's why context is so powerful. The more specific and targeted you can be, the more accurate your decisions can be. So before we go any further, one more opportunity for us to do a little audience participation. Does your organization factor context in to your succession strategy today? Do you use context as a factor in your succession strategy today? We're going to close down in 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Go ahead and close the poll. As you can see here, the majority of organizations still do not use context in your succession strategy. So let me just break this down a little bit more and help you understand when we say context, what does this actually look like? We identified through our research that there are 27 critical business contexts which truly impact leadership success. And we had an original list of about 300 that we thought could be factors, but really after our research, we found these are the 27 most critical business contexts. From there, an average job has between 3 and 10 of these contextual challenges that really define the role. And we'll walk through an example of this in just a few minutes. Through our research, we were able to pinpoint which natural attributes can help or hinder in any given context. So in essence, we can increase the prediction of leadership success significantly by looking at individual attributes and the fit to what the actual role needs to be successful. So let me just give you a couple of examples and break this down a little bit more. So then how would I know who has the potential to be successful in future leadership roles, but in what role? And that's really thinking about the question is high potential for what? Instead of taking months to answer a question around who would be a fit for a new role or how we should reorganize, you now get an answer in seconds by looking at context. This approach allows you to quickly build success profiles or competency models or contextual models. As we've discussed, as roles shift, this is really critical to be able to do this on demand. Understand who's a likely fit to be ready now. Understand aggregate views or where do you need to really focus development strength or development support to really increase your bench strength overall. And then it also provides understanding of who are hidden gems or people who you didn't originally consider for this role, but may be a great fit based on their personality and potential. I'm going to be really honest here and perhaps wave my dork flag a little bit high right now. I changed my entire career over this. I believe this is the coolest thing to happen in our industry since sliced bread. And truly, it is a game changer when you begin to utilize context. Because typically gathering data like this would take several months, a ton of investment, both from a time and cost perspective, from the HR team, from your leadership team, as well as from any high potential candidates. And now all of this can be done in seconds. And the reality is we developed this technology and this approach so that you can be in a meeting with a colleague and they could say, we need to open up an operation in China. and you could pull out your iPad or your computer or your cell phone, and within seconds you'd say, great, I think we've got a solid roster of candidates for that role. Let's continue and see who is going to be the best fit. So it really is designed to really support much faster decision-making, much clearer and accurate decision-making, and helping us ensure a diverse candidate pool. So let me break this down and actually give you a real example of how this could work. So let's say we would work with on a solar panel manufacturer and want to answer the question, who could be our next VP of marketing? You define the critical context in which your VP of marketing needs to execute. So for this role, we chose design and drive new strategies, drive network performance, deliver under high uncertainty and ambiguity, lead a centralized team, and ensure environmental sustainability, of course, because it is a solar panel manufacturer. As you've already had employees take the OPQ, or the Occupational Personality Questionnaire, as part of a hypo decision, we can repurpose that assessment data in order to provide data against these particular contextual challenges. We also can layer in a secondary measurement, which is what we would call an experience survey, because as we know, leaders are never good in all challenges, and experience can compensate for suboptimal fit. As an example, we could naturally be weaker in a particular area, but over a few years, we really have been working, developing skills, understanding how to overcome shortcomings. And because we have that experience, that should be layered into decision-making. We would select either the entire organization or a subset of the organization once we've defined the criteria, and then the data would come together to match who really is a high fit in this area. So as another example, as you can see here, the system would provide you with a short list of leaders to consider, folks who might be great but need a little bit more development space. So you can see in the right-hand corner, these are the folks that we should leverage. And the left-hand side, which you see invest, those are individuals who might need some additional development. On your lower left-hand corner, these are hidden gems, or people outside your hidden original search that may be a great fit for this role. And on the right-hand side, you see those aggregate capabilities, which allow you to understand if these particular challenges are a strength or weakness across the organization, and if this is something we should put considerable investment to develop a large portion of the organization to really be successful. Ultimately, factoring in context allows us to identify potential successors and increase the probability of success by 3x. So that's a really critical aspect of this, and why utilizing context is important to use in addition to competencies. So now one more thing to bring up, and I mentioned this earlier, business context is constantly changing as an organization shifts, as the way we work shifts, as the outcomes you need are shift. So as you think about context and measuring it utilizing personality, it simply requires a rerun of the data. So again, seconds versus months, in order to now looking at working with an intact team is no longer important because we're going to work across a matrix. We can easily bring in competencies that talk about working across a matrix. So you can shift your data set without having to go back and reanalyze or reassess your entire population. So let's move forward and talk a little bit about one other output for context. And that's when we begin to think about empowering individuals. It's not just a tool for HR and managers to create efficiency and understanding who has potential for a particular role. The individual gets value taking the assessments because now we can provide on-the-job development activities based on a future succession opportunity. So it's much more specific. And as we know, when we break apart how human behavior or adult behavior changes, we know that 70% of change happens from on-the-job activities, 20% through working with others, and 10% through formal opportunities. By focusing people on prescribed on-the-job activities based on the assessment results and the type of role they move into, we see much quicker, much faster development and much truer behavioral change. So using context is great for individual growth and development, retention, performance, and engagement. Let me just share with you a little bit of data around that. So first is around diversity. So as you can see in our research, actually 58% of high-fit candidates for a critical role were women. But when you look at the actual individuals who fill these leadership roles today, very few of them are women. So we've got tons of capability, tons of potential, tons of capacity, tons of competency, but we're not selecting those oftentimes because of the manager identified successor strategy. Certainly the second data point you can see here are a raise of engagement of individuals have a much higher engagement than low fit leaders. So we can really impact engagement by utilizing context as a selection criteria. The third area is all around hiring costs. So we can reduce hiring costs significantly, as we've seen, looking at both potential and context as a driver for organization. And last but not least, performance. And so high fit candidates are 4x more likely to be top performers than low fit candidates. So there are true business advantages to your organization to layering context into your conversation. Last but not least, I want to just talk a little bit about the fourth component, or the fourth question. Now that we've looked at, is our competency model accurate? Do we understand our bench strength? Do we understand who has that raw horsepower to be successful? And have we identified best fit leaders based on role context? Now we need to understand who is ready to start and move into an organization. So and typically when we think about a readiness assessment, this could be a simulation. It could be interview questions. It could be an assessment center. So anything that allows you to really try out your experience or prove that you're ready for a step jump gap. So we're going to go ahead and start with one more poll. This is how do you measure readiness in your organization today? And so if we could you please respond? Do you use simulations or assessment centers? Do you use interviews? Do you use personality assessment, or do you use cognitive ability assessment? We're going to close the poll in 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Great. And as you can see, the majority of organizations do use interviews, which is fabulous. We do see a fair number of simulations and assessment centers. Personality assessment and cognitive ability are a little bit lower. So this is great data, and we would have expected to see the exact thing, that most organizations utilize interviews as the primary way to measure readiness. But the reality is, utilizing assessment and development centers is actually the very best way to provide individuals an opportunity to really prove that they have the skills to be successful. So just like an astronaut has a flight simulator, your leaders have a leadership simulator in the form of an assessment center. So one more time, I want to underscore that this is a massive way to ensure a fair, objective, and valid selection system, and really increase the opportunity for diversity in your leadership. So utilizing these simulations is a really valuable way to create business, have ready now talent, to ensure that you understand the development opportunities or the onboarding support that a leader would need, and do that in a really efficient and effective way. That is because simulations utilize the technology candidates use in the real world today. So they'd sit down at a computer, see an inbox filled with emails, and potentially have calls, meetings, at presentations, etc., depending on what we need to measure for the particular role. This could include an analysis exercise, a written exercise, group sessions, client meetings, inbox simulations, etc. Assessment centers are not new. They've been in the industry for many, many years. But the approach to our virtual assessment centers is brand new. And in fact, SHL won the 2020 HR Technology Product of the Year due to our innovative approach to simulations. And as you can see on the meetings on the screen today, this is important. They can be pre-configured or tailored to your specific need. And the reality is, candidate is king. So the experience is really important to think about. So let me walk through that a little bit, because oftentimes organizations are afraid to introduce simulations or assessment centers because of a poor candidate experience. But we're actually allowing individual candidates to show or prove their performance and their strength in a particular area. So the experience looks a little bit like that. The participant receives an email at the start of the experience with an invitation to log in. They complete the registration and jump straight into an inbox simulation exercise and respond to the different questions that we've pre-configured based on the competencies and context that need to be measured. Then we would have any scheduled face-to-face or virtual interview or group sessions, and that could take the place of a media interview or an analysis exercise. And then last is they would receive their report with a clear understanding of development. So that is the candidate experience. Now, many organizations are interested in things like gaming. And in fact, when I joined SHL almost 9 years ago, or over 9 years ago, that was actually one of the most critical components. And we actually had a team of game developers that sat in here in our Atlanta office. The reality is we quickly understood candidate data does not like games. In fact, they want things to have face validity, so it looks and feels like the job they're applying for, and they want a real opportunity to prove or show that they're fit for the job. So over time, we've actually shifted our approach away from gamification into more simulation so that we can maximize the candidate perception. So let's talk a little bit about what the assessor experience is. And so the assessor experience is, instead of it being in the old days where you'd be in a live video interaction, or sorry, in a live interaction sitting across a desk, and your participants would have had to flown thousands of miles, stayed in a hotel overnight, picked up, have to go and sit in an odd office. Now we can do a lot of different assessment centers directly from an individual home. The assessor at real time can do things like comment on a live video interview. So I no longer have to wait and record it and go back and listen to it. Real time, I can be giving thumbs up or thumbs down. I can be commenting, providing feedback, and then really messaging between different observers and or participants from an assessor perspective. So that way we can understand who's going to take the next question and things like that. So it is a full service platform that really overcomes a lot of the challenges to legacy simulation usage. That ultimately utilizing simulations really helps your organizations in a couple ways. Objective data to help us make the data back decisions and remove bias from the process, allowing diversity to rise to the top, clearly an advantage for any organization today, especially for any leadership selection decision. Notes are consolidated for quicker response times. That makes sure we can have faster reporting and scoop those really good candidates off the market as fast as possible. We can repurpose the data once we have it to help us support organizational decision-making, talent mobility, developmental insights, mergers and acquisitions, reorganizations, any sort of question you have. Again, this data is designed to help support, so you don't have to have someone go back and take a 30-minute assessment every question you need asked. It'll also ensure you're making the most accurate decisions as you have a broad range of data, and it's real-world performance data versus a potential data. And that's really important differentiator. And lastly, it provides candidates with a realistic job preview to make sure they're actually going to enjoy being in the job and when they receive the role. So there certainly are a lot of decisions that can be driven much faster as a result of these simulations. So just to kind of refresh what we've talked about today, best-in-class succession strategies have multiple leader views to help answer each of the 4 questions. Those 4 questions, once again, are: who has the bench strength and who are your high performers? Who has the potential to be successful at a more senior level? What do they have potential for? And are they ready to step into a new role when it's open? And each of these lenses offers unique and valuable data point to help mobilize talent to the right role in an objective, data-driven fashion. Just to wrap up one more time, SHL and EPSI uniquely offers assessments that build over time to answer multiple data questions from utilizing one platform or technology. So this is something that is a true competitive advantage against any other provider you've seen out there, especially when you begin to think about utilizing competencies, high potential, and context in one view of a participant. I'm so grateful for the time we've shared today. I've tried to reserve the last 10 minutes or so of our session so that we begin to answer questions. So I'm just going to quickly move forward and ask if there have been any questions.
Before we go, Julie, I'd like to thank you for this wonderful presentation. I mean, you were active, you were lively. That was a really great time listening to you. So I personally thank you, and I'm pretty sure I can do it in the name of all the attendees we have. So we do have a few questions if you're ready for them. First one is: how reliable and accurate are the results of these tests in selecting a proper candidate? So I'm guessing, do you have any data on the reliability?
So I certainly will follow up with the exact specifications around that, but just to give you a little bit of an example, many of the tools used here are used truly millions of times across the globe. The average organization, we probably have and I'm just going to pick on our occupational personality questionnaire, which is the source of our high potential and our context measurement. That is delivered just in and of itself, that one assessment, multiple million times a year. And we probably do 8 to 10 validation studies on just that tool alone. So we're constantly looking to understand how we can upgrade and ensure it's a valid, reliable, objective measure of performance. So without a doubt, you can guarantee that any of the tools you'd be looking at have gone through a very thorough validation process and are continuously modified to make them more valid and appropriate. And I'll give you an example of that. despite the fact that this tool in some iteration has been around for almost 30 years, over the last few years, we've been looking at data and candidate perception around how long it takes to complete the assessment. So previously, the assessment would have provided a triad of 3 options. I enjoy what I do for work, I'm frequently on time, and I do a great job. Clearly, all 3 of those have been designed so that there's no one that's more socially desirable than another. They all are valuable for a job. And we previously would have said, pick the one that's most like you. And in the next screen with the 2 remaining, we would have said, pick the one that's least like you. We recently went through an entire upgrade of our assessment. So instead of having the cognitive dissonance of going most and least, we now go, what is the most like you? And then what is the second most like you, which is the exact same data point we got before, but it's reduced assessment seat time by almost 40%. So not only do we have validation evidence, technical manuals, et cetera, to back up the reliability and the accuracy of the assessment, we also are constantly monitoring the experience to ensure it is a great experience for all test takers.
Oh, I love that. I mean, it really means state of the art experience for the candidates. That's great, and it also means validity. Perfect, Julie. Another question: would your system require all employees in the organization to fill out questionnaires or info to start building the talent pool information?
So it's really every organization, most organizations aren't going to say we have 10,000 employees and we're going to give an assessment to 10,000 people in a month or less. It's a really unlikely situation where an organization will do that. Now, we do have one that has said we're going to give this to all 25,000 leaders that are in the director level subset of our organization. So it's not that it has never happened, it's that it just is not very, very likely. Most organizations will pick and start with a pilot so that they can show the example of how this would work. So they'd pick a particular level or a function to begin to gather data across the organization. And then they would use that to begin to make decisions and help model it and show that it's a great situation. Now, the reality is almost all the organizations that utilize us utilize our OPQ as a selection measure. So the talent has already taken half of the assessment needed to drive these additional systems. So quick answer is no, you don't have to have it for everyone. We would think about the type of question you need to ask and then identify the right population that we would assess in order to help solve that question and grow data over time. The good news is the OPQ is a reliable tool, meaning you can give someone the tool one day and then 6 months later and then 2 years later and then 3 years later, and their scores are almost always exactly the same. So this isn't a tool that is disposable, meaning it's got a single use. It is a tool that once you've given it to someone multiple times over their career, you can utilize this data over and over again to help drive decisions.
Oh, that's perfect. And a follow-up question on that one: how much time does it take to go through that test that you're talking about?
Great question. It is down less than 20 minutes to complete the assessment for our occupational personality questionnaire. Now, if you were to think about things like our cognitive ability measure, that's also something that's often used in tandem with our occupational personality questionnaire. That's a really exciting new approach. Previously, all cognitive measures were all legacy World War II multiple choice. Think about when you took your SATs or ACTs or GMAT. All of those types of questions, they've been around since the 50s. But the reality is, when we looked at equivalents of if you take this on your laptop and your iPad and your iPhone, do you get the same score across each experience? And we found that actually you do not. So SHL spent about 5 years completely redesigning how we measure cognitive ability and have developed what we call small business cognitive assessments. So they actually provide you an example, a situation like, say you have to schedule a meeting, how would you juggle things in order to make that happen? So it's a real world, again, drawing from our understanding of the gamification world, but it also allows us to provide a much faster measure of cognitive ability by utilizing tools like computer adaptive testing. So if you get one question right, the next question you get is more difficult. So we've been able to bring down the cognitive ability measure from well over 30 minutes to typically 15 to 18 minutes per assessment. So really exciting that we've been able to drive down seat time quite a bit while enhancing that customer experience or candidate experience.
Oh, that's wonderful. The person asked the question says, "Wow, that's fantastic. Thank you, and thanks so much for the time, for being so dynamic and informative." So I guess that's appreciation marks.
Yeah. Well,
Moving to the next another question, any work on virtual reality, it is around is it around the corner in the assessment world, or are we going to wait years before it appears?
it's funny. I just had a really in-depth conversation with my chief scientist officer about this. And the reality is virtual reality for use in a selection context is going to be very difficult because you need specified equipment to have the virtual reality fill that experience out. So we are looking at virtual reality. It's much easier done for in organization performance because you can have virtual reality equipment for your organization. But if you think about FedExing out virtual reality equipment to every candidate, it gets pretty costly and more difficult. Ultimately, that's why we designed our simulation platform so that we wouldn't need other equipment in order to provide that virtual dynamic environment where your phone is ringing, you have video conferences, you have emails coming in and IMs real time. So instead of it being on a particular set of machinery or equipment, we now have created that virtual reality environment in utilizing the materials you'd have at home, specifically to support that selection use case.
That's wonderful. So in other terms, you aim for like generalization. It becomes available for more people, and that comes at the cost that virtual reality isn't realistic for the point for the time given.
Exactly.
That sounds good. Another question. We have still a few minutes if you're up for it.
Sure.
Simulation tests measure someone's abilities at a certain point in time in a test atmosphere. Some people may not be comfortable in front of a test environment under pressure versus a live situation where they are not being pressured under possible time constraints versus a comfortable environment where they have time to assess the current issue provided. Does your test take these factors into account?
Certainly it's been validated that way, but the reality is in most of our jobs, we are under time constraints and we are like the challenges that you would feel in this are very real. Now, some of the things we do to help an individual become more comfortable, and I'll be honest, when I took my first role in consulting in this industry, I actually had to go through a full assessment center. And one of the things that made me feel most comfortable is they give you pre-work materials and support so that you can begin to think about your approach and understand the context of the organization and see opportunities before the experience began. Everything we do is really to help a candidate feel comfortable in the approach. And so our early communications and things like that are really designed to help reduce that pressure, but also having the time-bound measure is actually part of how we validated the experience to make sure it does actually predict on the job. And it is reflective of real world because, every day my job is moving from one meeting to another, making snap decisions as fast as we can. And that's how you should, depending on the role, we would have more time pressure and or less time pressure based on the competencies we need to measure.
That totally makes sense. So, in other terms, that pressure is normal. It's part of the game, if you want, if I can take the word. But you still try to alleviate that by going through a preparation beforehand. That helps a lot. That's what you say.
Exactly.
Excellent. I have a last question, if you don't mind, and then we'll be over. In a few, no, give me a second. Um, True thorough testing of potential feels overwhelming and threatening, while might feel overwhelming and threatening, especially for non-mat people or small businesses. Sometimes people are feeling like we're not ready, we're not too small. What would you say to these people?
What is the cost of not having the right leader when you're growing? It feels like a lot. And that's why you'd work with an organization that has done this a lot of times so they can help break this down into small chunks. I would say start like with the 4 questions, start in the beginning, understanding your current performance. Once you understand your current performance, understand who has that raw DNA. So you don't have to answer 4 questions this summer, break them down piece by piece and answer a question over question, but don't stop that pursuit until you have data for all 4. Who are my high performers and what does my bench strength look like today? Who has that raw potential? Who has potential for what? And is this person ready? Your succession strategy will never be truly successful until you have all 4 of those questions. So take it bite by bite, answer by answer, utilize tools that can begin to inform multiple of those decision points. So that way one interaction can provide multiple data points, and certainly reach out if you have concerns or questions. certainly both between our partners at EPSI and within SHL, we do
Mhm.
quite a lot of thought leadership and support and marketing events to help organizations understand how to take that first bite out of the succession apple.
In other terms, we don't have to do it on your own.
Exactly.
That's wonderful, Julie. That's all the time we have. So I'd like to thank you once again for being with us today and giving us this wonderful presentation. It is highly appreciated and very highly instructive. So thank you a lot. And I hope we might see you in other presentation, the symposium. Uh, Thank you.
We so appreciate being here. Thank you to all of our partners at EPSI. And certainly if you have any other questions, feel free to reach out via email. It's julie.stevens@shl.com or via LinkedIn. Thank you all so
Yes.
much.
Bye bye. Have a great day.